In recent years, an unexpected movement has begun to ripple through America's most elite universities. Students from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford are no longer chasing internships in New York or research grants in London. Instead, they are flying halfway across the world to a quiet city in the Philippines called Iloilo. There, they say, they've discovered something they didn't even realize was missing: the soul of education. At conferences in Chicago and Toronto, the name of one man keeps surfacing: Professor Michael Harper. Once a respected scholar at Harvard, Harper now stands on stage telling packed audiences that the future of learning lies not in Silicon Valley or Oxford, but in Iloilo. His words spark disbelief, even ridicule. Why would an Ivy League professor send the brightest American minds to study in a provincial Philippine city? Harper only smiles when asked. Because in Iloilo, he says, they teach you to be human before they teach you to be brilliant. His colleagues whisper that he's gone too far, that he's lost his sense of reason. Yet the numbers tell another story. More and more students are following his advice, trading glass towers for humble classrooms, choosing compassion over competition. They speak of lessons that change the heart as much as the mind, calling elderly patients Lola, sharing meals with families, discovering that education is not about standing above others, but about lifting them up. And somewhere between admiration and confusion, a single question begins to echo across American academia. What did Professor Harper see in Iloilo that changed him so deeply? The idea began as a whisper, something easily dismissed in faculty lounges and graduate seminars. But within a few years, it became a phenomenon. Across the United States, students who once dreamed of studying medicine in Boston or biotechnology in California were now buying one-way tickets to the Philippines, not to Manila, but to Iloilo, a place most of their professors couldn't even locate on a map. They came back changed. Their stories spread like wildfire through classrooms, podcasts, and online forums. One student from Yale wrote, "In Iloilo, I learned that healing isn't just about curing disease. It's about touching lives." A Harvard medical resident shared, "We don't call patients by bed numbers there. We call them by their names, sometimes even by family titles." I held a woman's hand and called her Lola. That single moment taught me more about medicine than 4 years in the lab. Soon, major education outlets began running headlines like, "The Iloilo Way, How a Small Philippine City is Redefining Compassion in Education." At first, critics mocked the movement. They called it sentimental, unscientific, a passing trend. But data told a different story. Students who spent a year in Iloilo showed higher empathy scores, better teamwork, and even lower burnout rates. Meanwhile, Professor Michael Harper became the unlikely center of it all. Invitations poured in, from Seattle to Toronto, from academic think tanks to faith-based organizations. People wanted to hear his message, that perhaps the West, with all its knowledge, had forgotten something essential: the wisdom of the heart. When reporters asked him why he risked his career on such a radical idea, Harper's answer was calm, almost gentle. "I used to believe education was about mastery," he said. "Now I know it's about meaning." Iloilo reminded me of that in faculty meetings back at Harvard. His colleagues teased him. "Michael, are you serious? You're telling our best students to study in a provincial city?" He smiled, unshaken. "Yes," he said, "because that city teaches what our systems forgot." As months went by, the ripple grew stronger. American students formed small circles called the Iloilo Fellowship, where they discussed human dignity, kindness, and humility, values often left out of syllabuses. And while many still questioned Harper's judgment, an undeniable curiosity began to spread. Somewhere in between skepticism and admiration, a quiet realization started to take root. Maybe Harper wasn't the one who had lost his way. Maybe he had simply found another path, one that led not to prestige, but to purpose. And as the movement gained momentum, one question remained unanswered. What had Harper experienced in Iloilo that transformed his entire understanding of education? It was a humid afternoon in Iloilo. the kind that made the air shimmer like glass. The university gymnasium overflowed with students in white uniforms, their families packed tightly into every corner. They had gathered for the commencement ceremony at the University of San Agustin, but the energy in the room wasn't just about graduation. It was about someone returning home, someone who once came here as a visitor and left as a believer. When Professor Michael Harper stepped onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. He looked older now, a little slower, but his eyes still held that quiet fire that students never forgot. He adjusted his glasses, smiled, and began, his voice soft yet firm. "I've taught at Harvard. I've taught at Yale. I've lectured in Oxford's oldest halls," he said, pausing as the crowd fell silent. "But none of those places ever taught me what Iloilo did. Because what you have here cannot be produced. It can only be lived." The audience hung onto every word. Harper spoke not about rankings or research, but about compassion. He told stories of students who stayed late after rounds to comfort patients, of professors who prayed before surgery, of communities that gave before they asked. His message was simple but profound. Education is not a race, it is a relationship. "I used to measure success by the number of degrees, the number of citations," he confessed. "But here, I saw something else. A student giving half her lunch to a classmate who couldn't afford to eat. A teacher walking home with a patient because he had no family." That, my friends, is what true learning looks like. Somewhere in the crowd, parents began to wipe their tears. Others simply nodded in quiet recognition. Harper continued, voice thick with emotion. "The world measures intelligence in data and titles. But Iloilo reminds us that wisdom is found in kindness. You don't just build doctors here, you build healers. You don't just raise teachers, you raise guardians of the human spirit." When he finished, there was no applause at first, just silence, heavy and sacred. Then the clapping came, slow and swelling, until the hall trembled with sound. Harper stepped back, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, he felt at peace with his purpose. That evening, he walked alone along the Iloilo River, the city glowing faintly in the distance. Children's laughter echoed from nearby houses. The air smelled of salt and rain. Harper looked out over the water and whispered to himself, "America has the wealth of the mind. But Iloilo has the wealth of the heart." And in that quiet moment, he knew his life's mission had changed forever. Not to chase prestige, but to protect a truth too rare and too precious to lose. It was during one of his earliest return visits to Iloilo that Professor Harper witnessed what he would later call the turning of his heart. The university had invited him to observe clinical training at a public hospital, a place where resources were scarce, but the atmosphere overflowed with care. He remembered walking through narrow corridors lined with patients on metal beds. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air. He was ready to see the usual efficiency and detachment he'd grown used to in American hospitals. Until a small moment shattered his expectations. A young medical student, barely 20, knelt beside an elderly woman whose frail hands trembled with pain. Instead of rushing through vitals, she held the woman's hand and whispered softly, "Lola, we're here. You're safe." Then she bowed her head and prayed, not as a ritual, but as an act of love. Harper turned away quickly, pretending to check his notes, but his eyes blurred. He had seen students in the U.S. diagnose faster, calculate cleaner, and speak with confidence, but never with such grace. Later, he wrote in his journal, "In Iloilo, medicine remembers its first purpose, to heal, not to impress." That evening, Harper was invited to dinner by his former student, Dr. Elena Ramirez, now a respected physician and professor. Her family welcomed him with warmth that felt almost impossible in its sincerity. Before the meal, they joined hands to pray. The youngest child, no older than 6, thanked God not for success or money, but for another day to help someone. Harper bowed his head, unable to speak. During the meal, Elena asked him gently, "In America, do your students still learn to respect the elderly?" Harper hesitated, his fork suspended midair. "We teach them to innovate," he said slowly, "but I'm afraid we've forgotten how to honor." The room grew quiet. Then Elena's father smiled kindly and replied, "Respect is a lesson no book can teach." That night, Harper sat at his desk by the guesthouse window, listening to crickets and the distant hum of the city. He opened his notebook and wrote, "I came to Iloilo to observe education. But Iloilo is teaching me something else, how to believe again." The following week, he visited West Visayas State University, where he sat in on a lecture about ethics in medicine. A student stood up and said, "If our patient is poor, it doesn't mean their life is worth less. We cannot let them die just because they cannot pay." The class fell silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. Harper closed his eyes and thought, "This is what we've lost." Every encounter, every small act of humility chipped away at the armor of cynicism he had built over decades in academia. By the end of his stay, Harper no longer saw Iloilo as an experiment in education. He saw it as a living proof that kindness, when taught with conviction, could become a curriculum of its own. When he boarded his flight back to Boston, he stared out the window at the receding islands and whispered, "They taught me anatomy, philosophy, and medicine, but Iloilo taught me hope." Years before his speeches and the headlines, before anyone called him the man who sent Harvard to Iloilo, Professor Michael Harper had boarded a flight with no particular expectation. It was meant to be a brief visit, 1 week in the Philippines to attend a small academic symposium in Manila, followed by a courtesy stop in Iloilo at the invitation of his former student, Dr. Elena Ramirez. He had accepted mostly out of politeness. To him, Iloilo was just another dot on the map, a quiet provincial city that couldn't possibly teach him anything new. When he first arrived, what struck him wasn't the architecture or the campus facilities. It was the people. Students greeted their professors with a small bow and a soft, "Good morning, sir." In the cafeteria, he watched one student help a janitor lift a heavy tray of dishes without hesitation, without an audience to impress. No one seemed in a hurry. No one seemed to compete. The air carried a kind of peace that felt almost foreign to him. At the University of San Agustin, Harper sat in on a class of anatomy students. The professor began by dimming the lights and asking everyone to close their eyes. "Before we begin," she said, "let us remember that the body we will study today belonged to someone who once loved, laughed, and dreamed. We honor their gift by learning with humility." Harper felt a jolt of unease. He couldn't recall a single moment in his decades of teaching when he had asked his students to feel gratitude toward the subjects of their study. In the halls of Harvard, knowledge was power. Here, knowledge was reverence. Later that day, he walked through the narrow streets near the university. Children ran barefoot along the road, waving at him with open smiles. Vendors offered him local food, refusing payment when they learned he was a guest. "Welcome to Iloilo," one of them said. "Here, everyone is family." The words stayed with him long after. That night at the small hotel where he stayed, Harper sat by the window looking out at the quiet city lights. He opened his journal and wrote his first real reflection. "There is something in this place that we've lost in the West. A simplicity that doesn't mean ignorance. A humility that doesn't mean weakness. They are not trying to conquer the world. They're trying to care for it." When he flew back to the United States a few days later, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. He looked at his students differently. He noticed how often they talked about prestige, about outcomes, about winning. And for the first time, those words felt hollow. That was when the idea began to form. Not yet a mission, just a quiet conviction. What if the best lessons weren't in the tallest buildings, but in the smallest classrooms? What if greatness didn't come from ambition, but from empathy? He didn't know it yet, but that fleeting thought, the one he scribbled somewhere between Manila and Boston, would change the direction of his life. It would grow into the question that would soon redefine him. What if the heart of education isn't found in the West at all, but in a small city called Iloilo? Years later, winter wrapped Boston in silence. Snow fell softly outside as Professor Harper sat alone in his office, surrounded by the same books that once defined him. Now just reminders of how much he had changed. On the wall behind him hung a single photo. He and a group of Filipino students by the Iloilo River, smiling under the golden sun. A young medical student knocked gently on his door. "Professor," she asked, "if you could send me anywhere in the world to truly learn what it means to heal, where would that be?" Harper paused, then smiled. "Iloilo," he said. "Iloilo, in the Philippines?" "Yes," he replied. "Go there if you want to learn what no textbook can teach you. There you'll remember that patients are not cases, but people. The West has knowledge, but Iloilo has heart." The student hesitated, then smiled back, sensing the depth behind his words. When she left, Harper leaned back, eyes on the photograph. For a moment, he could almost hear the laughter by the river, smell the warm rain, and feel the peace that place had given him. "They think I changed lives," he whispered, "but Iloilo changed mine." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and unhurried. And though the world moved on, the spirit of that small city lived quietly within him. In every class he taught, every student he guided, every heartbeat of the education he once thought he understood. Because in the end, Harper realized education was never just about shaping minds. It was about awakening hearts.